All right, y'all. Welcome here to the Rojava Must Survive call-in day of action, phone banking party, and teach-in. We're now going to transition to the teach-in portion of our event. And so I'm very excited to announce that we have today as our guest speaker, Meghan Bodette. Meghan is a US-based researcher, independent researcher who focuses on Kurdish issues, Kurdistan, and the Kurdish freedom movement. Meghan, we're really excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. Folks, stick around and listen what she has to say. It's all yours.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Arthur, and to the Emergency Committee for Rojava for having me here on this call. And thank you to everyone who's participating, because by being here today and listening and choosing to participate in this day of action, you have chosen to stand up and do something. And now is a time when, for the peoples of North and East Syria and the broader region, action is more necessary than ever. It's unfortunate that while I'm speaking to you, the situation is very difficult in North and East Syria, in other parts of the region, in Sinjar, in northern Iraq, and within Turkey itself, where Kurds and other minority peoples, including many communities that have suffered persecution at the hands of successive Turkish governments for decades since the founding of the modern Turkish Republic, are under heavy threat today. In North and East Syria alone, in the past several weeks, Turkish shelling has targeted civilian villages on the front lines of the region where Turkey invaded and occupied in October 2019, killing and injuring many civilians. A YPJ commander and a YPG commander were both killed in separate Turkish drone strikes, very close to those front lines as well, in targeted assassinations of these leaders who led the fight against ISIS and against Turkey and the radical extremist groups that Turkey supports. And then overall in North and East Syria, the ongoing crises caused by Turkish occupation, including a lack of water due to the water supply being cut off, including economic deprivation that's also exacerbated by US sanctions, including many different challenges from the war against ISIS, the displaced people, the struggle to rebuild as an unrecognized political entity. All of these threats are ongoing. The situation is very difficult, and yet people there do continue to resist. Moving to Iraq, we're seeing similar tragedy. Unfortunately, last week, within 48 hours, several Turkish strikes targeted a diplomatic convoy and a medical clinic in Sinjar, the home of the Yazidi people, a persecuted minority that suffered genocide at the hands of ISIS 7 years ago. The strike on the convoy killed a Yazidi commander in the YBS, the Sinjar resistance units, which is a force made up of local Iraqi Yazidis, men and women who survived genocide and are now struggling to defend their community and ensure that they will never again go without self-defense and self-protection. And then the second strike, one day later, targeted a medical clinic in a village where wounded YBS fighters were being treated, killing both Arab and Yazidi YBS fighters and medical workers there supporting them. Witnesses said that the area was actually targeted more than once, and that after people rushed to the aid of the wounded, more strikes hit the same medical clinic, damaging the facility completely, destroying it altogether, and harming those people who had gone to try to rescue survivors. And again, like in Rojava, people in Sinjar, the Yazidi people, after all they've gone through, they continue to resist too. They continue to stand up. And we're seeing the same thing within Turkey itself. Whereas many of you know, the People's Democratic Party, which is the pro-Kurdish, pro-religious freedom, pro-women's equality political party there, that shares the values of the autonomous administration of pluralism and equality and democracy, has faced a legal case that would ban the party altogether. Police brutality, torture, repression of activists and political figures, all are still going on, particularly those who criticize these aggressive foreign policies and who call on their government not to take this aggressive and illegal military action against the peoples of Iraq and Syria, including Kurds, including Yazidis, Assyrians, Armenians, and many others. So while all of this is going on, It's not, one can't sugarcoat it. It's a very difficult situation in the region. And that makes what we're doing today more important than ever. Because I can tell you that people on the ground right now in North and East Syria, in Sinjar, in Turkey, in the entire region, they haven't given up. They haven't been so impacted by these unilateral, illegal war crimes and threats against their defense forces and their people that they've refused to take action. If anything, they're continuing to stand up and fight for their values even more strongly than before. Right now, we're seeing in North and East Syria that even despite all of these challenges caused by, years of conflict, by invasion and occupation, and by neglect and even purposefully imposed harm by outside powers, they're still working to build the equal and pluralist society that I know many of you are here because you support. I don't think I need to go into too much detail to tell you about how North and East Syria is the only place in the region and much of the world where all leadership positions are shared between men and women, so gender equality is guaranteed. I don't think I need to tell you that it's men and women of many different ethnic and religious communities resisting together on the front lines, protecting their villages from ISIS and from Turkish-supported extremist groups. I don't think I need to explain, though the situation in Sinjar is less well known, they have a very similar autonomous administration model, and they too have called for autonomy in line with existing Iraqi law, something that's, capable of being done, and for the existence of their self-defense forces so that Yazidis are able to govern and defend themselves without being forced to rely on the outside powers that failed them 7 years ago. And in Turkey, even with all of the repression that pro-Kurdish, pro-minority rights, and general progressive and left-wing opposition is facing, they're still standing up. They're still opposing Erdogan's regime. They're calling out these military operations. Many of these groups have made statements very strongly condemning what's going on. They've demanded investigations into Turkey's behavior towards extremist armed groups, towards ISIS members in the country, and asking why, when ISIS members go free without any consequences for the atrocities that they committed in Syria, Turkey bombs the people who defeated ISIS and the civilians who, despite everything, managed to survive what ISIS did in the Middle East. So people all across the region are standing up to protect the values of peace and pluralism and democracy that we see in, these democratic confederalist systems that they're putting into place. And that is something that I think we all should internalize as we look towards what we can do about this. Now, I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm sure that all of us are very aware of how difficult it can be sometimes to get people to pay attention to human rights and oppressed people here. And I know that with the ongoing situation in Afghanistan, where we're seeing what decades of war and intervention by foreign powers and support for extremist groups and for unaccountable militants can do, that humanitarian catastrophe is something that's occupying a lot of political bandwidth right now, and for, a very good reason. But I think that shows us too how when we have places where people have banded together and created an alternative to dictatorship and religious fundamentalism and ultranationalism, it's more important than ever that we stand with those people trying to build that society wherever they might be and oppose these policies that happen when our government is complicit and supportive of these attacks. And that's a real reality. As an American citizen, it pains me to know that when Turkey attacks the men and women fighting against ISIS in Sinjar or in Northeast Syria, they're probably doing it with American-made F-16s and American-supplied parts in drones. That's something that's on all of us. But there's also very hopeful signs for that, because I can tell you, as someone in DC working on these issues, our elected representatives are capable of being convinced, and many are already here after this past several years of the current Turkish government's behavior. They understand that what Turkey is doing is not in the interests of the peoples of Turkey. It's not in the interests of the stability and freedom of Syria and Iraq, and it's not in the interests of the American people. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to speak up, and we're going to show them exactly why it's not in our interests and it's not aligned with our values. Now, I know the campaign that we're going to do today is very well put together, and I want to thank the Emergency Committee for Rojava for doing that. The main demands that are going to be on there that I would stress now, given the situation in the region, are the recognition for North and East Syria and everything that would come along with that about aid, so they can have a real economy that serves their people. Vaccines, the ability to fight the coronavirus crisis, this pandemic that's devastated these, poor and exploited areas of the world so much. That recognition, that ability to politically deal with them, that's something that's very important. And when we call for that recognition, we're calling for, legitimizing and supporting and protecting what thousands of men and women, people whose names we'll never know, have built every day to create that democratic pluralist system, that's drawn all of you to support this group and this call. So that's really impactful. You can do that. There are people in this city in Washington who are willing to listen to that. And when they hear from you and you say that that's something that matters to you, that can push policy. So that's very important. And the second thing we're going to be talking about that I think is very relevant given the tragedies we've seen over the past several weeks is imposing consequences on Turkey. Throughout the entire history of the Turkish-Kurdish conflict, Turkey has been a NATO member state for a very long time, and it is NATO support, training, weaponry, particularly American, but if anyone's calling in from Europe, many European governments are involved in this as well, and there are very strong solidarity movements there, in terms of boycotting Turkey and ending arms sales that I think we in the United States can learn a lot from. But the United States has supported every atrocity and every excess of Turkey's war on not only the Kurdish freedom movement, but the Kurdish people. And I don't think that it can even be called into question the devastating impact of that. That has not made any American safer. It has not made any citizen of Turkey safer, but it has caused untold devastation to entire Kurdish communities and other minority communities who have been forced from their homes, who live under the threat of airstrikes and drone strikes, who've been targeted in so many different ways, displaced across the region and across the world. So as Americans, we have a responsibility to stand against that. And I can tell you that there's good news in Washington, D.C. on that front. Recently, a letter signed by, I believe, 28 members of Congress explicitly called for an investigation into and an end to the use of US origin material in Turkish drones. And that's one of Turkey's most devastating weapons programs. That's what's targeting these civilians in places like Sinjar and across Iraq and Syria, targeting the men and women who defeated ISIS and who are fighting for simply the political rights of all of the communities of the Middle East. That program does not make anyone safer. It does not make anyone more secure. And, its targets have included people like the Congress Star activists who were killed in Rojava last summer in a meeting, women's rights activists working for nothing but a more free and equal society. Its targets have included, the targeted assassinations of some of the commanders in the fight against ISIS in vulnerable places like Sinjar, where had the Kurdish movement not responded and had local people not been willing to stand up and fight for themselves and create their own defense forces, there wouldn't be anybody left. So when we stand against the United States' complicity in these devastating campaigns against civilians and against local self-defense forces protecting vulnerable communities in Iraq and Syria, that's very important. Congress is already suspicious of it. They need to know that we don't support what Turkey is doing. And I think that that's what we're going to be able to show to everybody today. And so once again, I want to thank everybody for being here and for the willingness to take action and not just listen to what I'm saying, but to go and actually do something about it. I think a lot of times we feel as though we don't know what to do, or as though, in our individual capacity, there's very little that we can do. But this kind of work is something that is very possible. Anyone can make a phone call to their members of Congress. As a constituent, you can ask to meet with your member of Congress. You can say, as a person in your district, I want to say this, and this about this issue. And even the people that we won't be calling as constituents, it matters, particularly on the phone when you hear from them. Something that anyone can do is writing op-eds, getting these issues out into the news. That's always possible. really the fact that there's no information countering Turkey's narratives is something that's often very difficult. And having good opinion and good analysis, because we know the facts on the ground, right? We all know who Turkey is really targeting. We all know the details of the political structures and the social movements that have been created. We need to tell the entire world about that. Everybody needs to know about the ideas and the people and the struggle that's been going on in that part of the world, and how a state that's allied with the US is targeting it. Because look, I think if you told 100 random Americans what the people of North and East Syria had built politically, what they had accomplished militarily, and the values and ideas that they had done all of that for, I think 99 of them would agree that we should support them and we should not help Turkey target them. So getting that good information out there, spreading awareness, that's something that's very valuable. So there's any number of actions, and it's very easy to just be that one person, to start and do something. And if you can do these calls today, you know, I'm certain that you can continue to take action in a variety of other fields as well. So I'm really happy to see that, know that this is very important, and know that, you know, hopefully this can just be the beginning, that I'll see all of you continuing to advocate and write and protest, and in whatever way that you work on these issues, in whatever capacity that you can, continue to speak out, stand up for the people of North and East Syria, what the people across the region, you know, fighting for those same ideas of peace and freedom and democracy. And yeah, keep taking action. So I really appreciate that. Thank you for listening to this talk and this overview of the situation. And I'd love to take questions if anybody has any.
Thank you so much, Megan. That's a great talk. And we're really lucky to have you here. I want to say that I think instead of taking questions via audio, we'll go ahead and just encourage people to write questions in the chat. And Megan, you can feel free to kind of choose them at will. So folks, feel free. If there's too many questions, we may not have a chance to cover all of them, but take a minute right now and go ahead and write your questions in the chat.
I'll try to answer anything I can. This is a Democratic Confederalist group. All questions are equally important. So I'll try to get to as much as possible. I appreciate the people saying thank you. I want to thank you all for being here. I'm doing nothing. I'm just here telling you things that, you know, we all already know. You're the ones who are going to be, you know, talking to our legislators and hopefully making actions happen. So no need to thank me.
You also may have just covered so much that there's no questions left. Here we go.
Besides calling electeds and bureaucrats, what else can people do? That's a wonderful question. Because as we all know, there are many forms of political action that can be taken, and on issues like this, where it's both, you know, a very powerful solidarity movement and something that involves interacting with elite politics. There's many ways to take action and many ways that anyone in their individual capacity can help. I think one thing, you know, I know that the emergency committee and other people do organizing demonstrations when there are, you know, these escalations and these attacks at your local Turkish consulate. That's something that can do, you know, to get attention, especially if you can bring media coverage. One thing I do, you know, I am a researcher. I do a good bit of writing and analysis. And I often find when I'm talking to people, you know, well-meaning, interested people, that they just quite simply have no idea what's going on over there because they've never seen a good piece of news coverage. They've never read, you know, a book that talks about this, you know, in a way that portrays the reality on the ground. They've just found it difficult to find the information. So I would recommend, you know, if you can just inform the people around you. Maybe that is writing an op-ed to your local paper. Maybe that is, you know, getting your friends and family involved in solidarity actions like this one's. Maybe that is, you know, any way that you can reach out to the media or other groups or, you know, doing presentations like this, spreading the word and making sure that as many people as possible know what's going on and what are the stakes. That's something very valuable that can be done. I think in the future, as we look at more kinds of action that can be taken, the emergency committee does a great job on that. There are, political representations here in DC for the political missions of, the Syrian Democratic Council. They often, talk about their goals. So keeping up with what's being asked for from over there and thinking about, how in your capacity or in your group or organization's capacity can you support it is an ongoing process. And there's lots of ways to get involved. And you're certainly all, if you're here on this call, you're listening to the people who will know what to do. And then on the other hand, if you have an idea for, if there's a group in your community, if there's something you want to do, if you think, oh, I'd love to screen this film or do a talk for this book or, get this group in my community involved in contacting our elected representatives, you should speak up. I think anyone here probably has great ideas for how to work on this in their local context. So I would recommend that. And yeah, no, that would be, my answer is there's basically so much that can be done that we could have a whole other call on what to do in terms of strategy. And if any of you have ideas or want to ask me about what's going on in Washington, I will put my WhatsApp and my Twitter in the chat so you can reach out to me. Okay. So I think Meghan mentioned that it was autonomy that was being called for. So is this calling for the official recognition of some sort of federal system, or what sort of autonomy is being called for? So that gets a little bit complex because on the one hand, you have what the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria is calling for within the borders of Syria itself and in terms of the Syria debate.
I think Megan's just grabbing a glass of water here, but one thing that I'm adding in the chat here, another idea. Oh, I sent it as a direct message on accident. What you can do if you're a member of a progressive organization that's interested in joining the Rojava Must Survive campaign, please get into contact with us. Send an email to info@defendrojava.org. I'll put it in the chat here to everybody. But do sign on. We have a list of, I think, 25 international co-sponsors right now, and we want to grow that as big as possible. Back to you, Megan, if you're good. Oh, I have to ask you to unmute since you muted yourself, I believe. How's that?
Yep, no, I am unmute. I have my water. I have my Jinjian Azadi coffee mug right here. But yeah, so essentially there's the autonomy that they want within Syria, which is to be negotiated. That will be with the government of Syria, with Russia, with the United States, Iran, all of the major players will have, a vote, so to speak, in that. And then what's being called for with recognition by the United States or by European countries or essentially by any outside power is not necessarily going to look like, a specific law or diplomatic recognition saying, we recognize the autonomous administration as this entity. I know that one thing that has been talked about with engagement in Congress is a congressional resolution that would say that, but that's also something that could come from the bureaucracy. There could be internal guidance saying, we interact with this part of the region differently than we do with other parts of Syria on, things like economic issues, that sort of engagement. And that could be almost a de facto recognition. That could come from any part of the government. I think one thing that could be good and what I would recommend would be calling for Congress to do something, because they tend to be, in my analysis, the most willing to listen on these issues. The State Department has, because of NATO, those very long-standing ties with Turkey and is obviously unelected. So they don't have those ties to constituents and that avenue to meet with community groups and people like us that Congress does. So there are a fair number of ways that could happen. I think congressional engagement and getting them to pass something is probably the best way in my experience of understanding that. So, What form does recognition of a stateless democracy by nation state entities would look like? Are there specifics we can advocate for with nation state decision makers? Excuse me. Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. I think, again, what we're talking about in terms of legal recognition is, the ability to sort of the assurance that that is a government and a political body. I'm so sorry. That can be dealt with in a way that is separate from the existing government of Syria. Oh my goodness. Okay, so what we're dealing with is we're talking about essentially the assertion that the autonomous administration is a separate entity from the government of Syria, and thus in terms of diverting things like aid, like COVID-19 vaccines, like other resources, that when those things are apportioned and given out by countries, by international organizations, that they can go to the autonomous administration as the representation of the people in that region. They're not calling for independence. I'm sure everyone on this call understands, the democratic confederalist idea is not necessarily, it's refuting the idea that you need your own nation state, but it's instead saying, overcome the nation state with these local political bodies being created, these forms of government and self-defense that are, along the lines of what's being done in Northeast Syria. So it would simply be a series of political decisions that treat North and East Syria as the legitimate representative politically of the people who live in that geographic area that that governing body exists in. And that it's not, just a part of the Syrian state, that it's not simply a non-state actor only on the military side, but that it is a political body, that is representative of that population in the area where it is, and that it's dealt with diplomatically accordingly. Philosophically, that's a fascinating question, and I'd love to look into that more and talk about it. And I'm sure that there are other cases of similar non-state entities, but what that de jure recognition will look like and what's been recognized de facto so far is an interesting debate. So that's my answer to that. Is there any indication that US personnel may be operating drone strikes in terms of Turkish strikes against targets affiliated with the Kurdish movement? It is my understanding that there was reporting in early 2020 that the US had previously cooperated on intelligence on some of those strikes, but that was halted sometime in relation to the Turkish invasion of Serikaniye and Tel Abyad in 2019. So there's a history of intelligence collaboration, if not direct, operation there. It's something that the US is very involved in more on the technical side, especially in that they get the components of their weapons. And I'm not aware of what degree the intelligence cooperation exists, but that's something that's been there historically and may have changed or shifted recently. So it's more indirect US involvement, but very sustained and systemic indirect US involvement on those issues. Turkey insists that they are going after the PKK in Sinjar, but we know that the PKK left long ago. Do you know whether political leaders in the US buy that line by Turkey, or generally speaking, how do they justify allowing Turkey to trample a people who suffered genocide? I wish I knew the answer to that question, because I believe that it is unjustifiable. We know, having spoken to Yazidis who work on humanitarian issues and made contacts with the Democratic Autonomous Administration in Sinjar, this is terrifying the local population. Yazidis who were displaced in 2014 feel like they can't go back. The Yazidis who are in Sinjar are terrified. Those who have, participated in the YBS, the local defense forces, and the Democratic Autonomous Administration are all, to some extent worried that the same thing could happen to them simply because they chose to fight for or represent their community. And I'm sure people saw, that the United States' statement about it was that, we are aware of press reports of Turkish strikes in northern Iraq. They didn't even mention Sinjar or Yazidis at all. So I think that it's my understanding that there are differences of opinion among different people and different departments. And that's something that if you choose to do this kind of advocacy in this sort of, traditional politics space, you'll find that not everyone agrees. But there is a very strong contingent of people who accept the Turkish narrative without criticism. And that's something that's very dangerous because we know that the Turkish narrative is very flawed and something that we're working to change, that by providing better information, whether that's better news articles, better analysis, better media coverage, informing your members of Congress as a constituent, organizing these protests, getting the word out, spreading statements made by the local leaders there. All of that is an essential component of this. They won't know what's going on unless people tell them. And Turkey has been telling them what's going on for a very long time. So that narrative is very entrenched, unfortunately. I know that there are efforts going on to really force the issue of Sinjar, particularly because of what the Yazidis suffered and how harmful the Turkish strikes are. But there are going to need to be a lot of people who will need to be convinced in order to push for greater action on that, which is very sad, but it is a reality. And that's something that I know that advocacy like this, when we talk about North and East Syria, there'll be more advocacy to come on issues in other regions, to do with other persecuted communities there as well. So getting that counter to the Turkish narrative out there and ensuring that it is, airtight, that it is backed up by facts and, experiences from the ground, and that people see it and can sort of challenge what Turkey is saying is what's essential there. So thank you for that question. Is UN recognition or cooperation with the Palestinian Authority by the UN in some respects regarding recognition of Rojava? So I'm unfortunately not an expert on the Palestinian situation, and I wouldn't know much as to how they got their UN recognition or the way in which that worked, so as to be able to apply it to the case of Rojava. Of course, I believe that there are many different, both internationally with organizations like the UN, both bilaterally with relations with individual countries, and then simply de facto in terms of facts on the ground. There are many paths to many different kinds of recognition, but I unfortunately don't know enough about the Palestinian case to speak to how that would relate to Rojava. Oh, more questions. Everyone has questions. We love this.
Maybe if it's okay with you, Megan, we'll take, not to put you on the spot or to pick and choose, but we probably want to transition soon. So
Okay.
maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll start making phone calls.
Well, I'll take as the last one, and I love this. What resemblances do you see between the struggle in Rojava and the struggles of peoples in the US? Because we're not so much fighting the state itself, but the system of the state. And I'm wondering if there are examples you've come across that can help people relate to the Kurdish struggle. I love this, and this is a wonderful question. And this is something that, as we come to deal with the contradictions of needing, on the one hand, to push a government to take action in its foreign policy to do less harm and to stop supporting an autocratic ally and to stop targeting vulnerable people, we're coming up against, the same thing that we come up with when we look at issues of injustice on the same lines here. What they're fighting against in Rojava is, as the person who asked this question said, it's a system. They're going up against racism and religious prejudice and ethnic prejudice and all the attitudes that any given group of people has towards another that says that they're inferior because of their culture or the language they speak. And they're trying to replace that with a society where they celebrate the different histories and heritages of the people there, where they make amends for what different groups have done in the past and try to build a common future together. You know, the struggle for the freedom of women is something that's universal. There is no country in the entire world today where women are equal to men. There's misogyny and the oppression of women exists everywhere. And we see, you know, that while the fight against those forms of oppression takes different forms, that what's been done in Rojava to advance women's rights has lessons for us everywhere. You know, we see that they're fighting against authoritarian systems, against religious fundamentalists, against nationalist prejudices. Those are prejudices and systems that everyone everywhere in the world in different ways contends with. So a lot of what they're doing is very universal. You know, I think a person anywhere can see their struggle and can see that the systems they're opposing exist everywhere and impact the lives of people in every country. I would say the lessons that we take from them are, first of all, you know, they say in Kurdish, "Berkhodan jiyane," this is life. And I think that unshakable commitment to improving your community together with the people around you is something that we can very much learn from their struggle, because they continue that against all forms of adversity, in conflict, in repression. You know, they continue to stand up and resist and say that whatever you do, you know, you'll make us 10 times more motivated to keep fighting and keep building our society. So I think we can learn that from them. I think the necessity of collective activity, of people working together and realizing that the different struggles and different challenges that we all face are connected, is something that's very important for us to learn to them. And, you know, I think that we all know that, and people in the US know that. What we've seen over the past several years of activism are people who do understand that, look, if my neighbor is oppressed, then I'm not free, you know, and that I don't want to live in a society where someone who has a different disadvantage or different, you know, identity than I do has to struggle, even though I don't. And I think that that concept of solidarity and of understanding that, you know, we have to fight all of these systems at once is something to learn from North and East Syria as well, when we see how, you know, they're going after all of these different structures and all of these different prejudices. And so I think that there's a lot that, you know, we can learn from them. And that makes what we're doing here even more important, because, you know, and a lot of what I do, right, it doesn't always feel like you're supporting, you know, a liberation, a revolutionary cause. Sometimes it simply feels like you're writing endless Google documents and, you know, talking to people who work in politics. But as we, you know, both act as, you know, we're in some ways obligated to as Americans to, you know, oppose the harm that our government supports abroad, and, you know, defend the peoples who are the target of a country that's very closely allied with the US. And as we take action to protect and help ensure that, you know, these places where people are fighting for these values and opposing these systems can survive, I think that that supports the struggle for freedom everywhere, the struggle for peace and democracy and pluralism, you know, and for ending these prejudices and these structures everywhere. Because when we have that victory in Rojava, that's a victory in some ways for us too. And that's true, I think, you know, across the world. And when we see their outlook and their solidarity with struggles elsewhere, you know, keeping that in mind, that these are gains for all people, and that these are also something that as Americans, you know, as citizens of a country allied with Turkey, that we have a very serious both responsibility and capacity to work to impact. You know, I think that it's a difficult task, but I think that there's a great deal of inspiration in what the people that we're standing with have done and will continue to do. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. And with that, we can get to work.
Thank you so much, Meghan. It's wonderful to have you here, and it's wonderful to have everybody's so many great questions. Great to have you all join us here. But again, at the end of the day, we're here to try to get to these decision makers and influence US policy, which has an enormous impact, at least potentially, on what happens on the ground in Rojava, in Kurdistan. And communities there could use our support more than ever right now. So what I'm gonna do is copy paste our toolkit in here. At least that was the idea. I know I've shared it several times, but we have a call-in script. We have target phone numbers for key members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And we're gonna go ahead and give them a call. And so we encourage everybody to stick around here. But again, thank you so much, Megan, for having us, and for everybody else for joining. I think, it's easy to feel sometimes like Megan was alluding to, a lot of people come to this cause because they're inspired by the radical revolutionary transformation that's being led by the Kurdish freedom movement in the region. And they're coming from their own place, maybe, of radical politics. And sometimes getting on the phone and calling Bob Menendez doesn't always feel like the most exciting revolutionary act. But, time after time again, what we're hearing from folks on the ground is that we need you to do what you can in your own country to push policy because it impacts us here. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to do that work in the little ways that we can. And it's also worth mentioning that this campaign is, we've launched in the end of June, but we are still building and growing this campaign. We're still growing the kind of coalition that's being built around it of all these wonderful allies from around the world. And so, this is just one tool in the toolbox, so to speak. It's just one tactic, and we're going to continue to expand and grow our tactics as we march on into the future here. So here's the call-in toolkit. I wanted to also just directly dump in some of these key phone numbers. And I'm also going to share our script directly. So obviously this link will take you to all of this stuff and more. We also have some extra credit in the toolkit where folks can call all these different, not just the single DC office, but kind of district offices, other numbers that we've come across for these targets. You also can send emails to those offices as well so that they have written follow-up. We even have a sample email text and everything in the toolkit. But just so everybody has it, we're going to go ahead and transition here, and I'm going to turn off the recording and stay on, and we'll get to work. Thanks. Solidarity.